Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. Today we're bringing you a March of the Machine Commander game. You could join us on Discord or Patreon. First up is Chris playing Kroxa Kunoros. He's looking to escape all sorts of stuff from his graveyard. Kyle is playing the epitome of Sultai colors in Zimone Dina, drawing cards, draining opponents' landfall triggers, what's not to love. I'm playing Sidar Jabari of Zalfir. Not easy to say, but fun to play. Knight Tribal plus loot and reanimation. Big fan. Last up we have Scott playing Blinkosaurus, aka Etali, Primal Conqueror. He's looking to cast all of his opponent's spells, or possibly infect them to death. Please subscribe if you haven't already. My god, do we need it. And stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Chris kicked us off by playing a mountain into a soul ring before passing to Kyle, who plays Vine Glimmer Snarl. Passing to me, I play a Godless Shrine and take 2 damage in order to cast Foulmire Knight. It's a 1/1 Death Touch Knight, watch out. On Scott's turn, he plays Urza's Saga before passing back to Chris, who plays Takanuma, Abandoned Mire, as his land for turn, and then he casts Stitcher's Supplier with it. When that enters the battlefield, he'll mill 3 cards from the top of his library, and then he'll cast Phyrexian Altar. So now he can start sacrificing his creatures and generate some mana of any color. He passes to Kyle, who draws and plays Underground River as his land for turn before casting Sylvan Library and passing. On my turn, I draw and play an island as my land, and then I move to combat. I attack Kyle with my 1/1 because it's Kyle. This triggers my commander in the command zone given Eminence, so I draw a card and I discard a card, putting a knight into the bin. I cast Arcane Signet on my second main before passing the turn to Scott. He ticks down his Urza Saga after drawing and plays Sanctum of Eternity. That land could allow him to bounce his commander in a later turn. On Chris's turn 3, he plays Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, so everything's a swamp. Then he plays Undead Butler, milling an additional 3 cards from his library into his graveyard. It's kind of like Stitcher's Supplier, but worse. On Kyle's turn, he draws, and then he gets to draw 2 more thanks to Sylvan Library. He puts them both back though. Then he drops a land before casting his commander, Zimone Dina. After that, he'll pass the turn back over to me. I'll draw and play a swamp as my land for turn, and I move to combat, again attacking Kyle because he's Kyle. He is up to no good. Objectively, I'm assessing him as my biggest threat. When I attacked, I drew and discarded, and then in my second main phase, I cast my commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir. This guy's great. I pass the turn, and after Scott draws, he upticks Urza's Saga. That will allow him to go fetch up the best 1-drop artifact in the game, a Soul Ring. And following that, he'll play a land for turn, and it's a Valakut Stoneforge. And then he'll pass the turn over to Chris, and on Chris's turn 4, his first order of business will be to activate Phyrexian Altar, sacrificing his Stitcher's Supplier, therefore milling 3 more cards. After that, he'll sacrifice his Undead Butler as well, so now he'll have 2 floating mana, enough to cast Kroxa Kunoros. When that enters the battlefield, he'll functionally escape something from his graveyard, exiling 5 cards and bringing back Flayer of the Hatebound. And when that ETB'd, its trigger hits the stack, and he uses 4 damage to kill my commander, which makes me very sad and hate you, Chris. Just kidding, I'm not competitive since the incident. I put my commander into my graveyard, and then Chris passes the turn.
Zimone's like, yo, you drew a second card this turn because it's Sylvan Library, so I'm going to drain you for 2. Heck, Christopher Spaghetti. And then I'm not a coward this time, so I will take 6 damage from Sylvan Library. So I'll take 8, because I already gained the 2, right? But it'll be net 6.
Then Kyle casts Jol Rael, Manvuli Recluse, pronounced flawlessly. Then he casts Skyclave Shade, or as Kyle likes to call it, Bad Bloodghast, or Badghast. He passes the turn over to me. I play an island as my land for turn before casting Reanimate on my commander who I left in my graveyard. So I'll lose 4 life, and Sidar Jabari Zalfir will enter the battlefield once again. I much prefer him on the battlefield. Following that, I cast Adaptive Automaton, obviously naming Knight as the chosen creature type, so pumping my whole team. Then I move into combat. I attack Kyle with my 2/2 Death Touch. This triggers my commander, so I'll draw a card and pitch a card to the bin. Kyle takes it, and I pass the turn to Scott, who plays Jessica's Will. But in response to that, out of fear of him casting his commander, I cast Fierce Guardianship. And because my commander's on the battlefield, it's for free. What? As a follow-up, he casts Voyager Staff, and that could allow him to flicker something on a future turn. On Scott's end step, I cast Swords to Plowshares on Chris's commander. However, he'll respond by sacrificing his commander to Phyrexian Altar, floating a red mana. He'll also sack his Flayer of the Hatebound in order to cast Cathartic Pyre, discarding 2 and drawing 2. This also triggers his Dragon's Rage Channeler, so he'll surveil 1, and he'll bring back Flayer of the Hatebound because it has Undying. so it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and due to that, he can throw 5 points of damage, and he targets my commander a second time. Thanks, Chris. On his turn, he drops a mountain before casting Liliana, Waker of the Dead. This thing can make us discard, shrink a creature, or reanimate stuff. This also triggers DRC again, so he'll surveil and put a Fleshbag Marauder into the bin. He +1s Lily, making us discard or lose 3 life. In response, Kyle activates his commander. He sacrifices Badgast and gets to play a Watery Grave tap. Chris's opponents discard cards before he moves to combat, attacking Scott with Flayer of the Hatebound, dropping him to 35. Then he passes the turn. Kyle draws from Sylvan Library. This triggers his commander and Joel Rael. He drains Chris 2 and gains 2 and makes a cat token. He decides to keep both of his Sylvan Library cards, losing 8 life, casting Zendikar's Royal afterwards. And after that, he'll drop his land for the turn, which is a Golgari Rot Farm. This will trigger his Zendikar's Royal and bounce a land back to his hand, getting a 2/2 elemental in the process. On my turn, I hop right into the red zone towards Chris this time. This triggers my commander, so I'll draw a card and discard a card. I throw Elinda and Azora in the bin. On second main phase, I play Shattered Sanctum as my land for turn, before recasting my commander, Sidar Jabari of Zalfir. Again. I assume Chris will blow it up any minute now. On Scott's turn, he finds a forest, and then he plays Farseek. And he goes and finds another land from his library and placing it out onto the battlefield. In this case, a Cinderglade. He passes the turn over to Chris, who draws, and he starts sacking his stuff to Phyrexian Altar to generate mana. Then he casts Dark Ritual, and this will net him enough manas in order to recast his commander, Kroxa and Kunoros. And with that entering the battlefield, he can exile 5 cards from his graveyard. This allows him to return a Sun Titan from his graveyard to the battlefield, and due to that, it triggers his Flayer of the Hatebound. He targets Zimone Dina with 6 points of damage. In response, Kyle activates it, sacking an elemental, drawing a card, playing a forest as his land before Zimone Dina dies. Then Sun Titan will bring back a Stitcher's Supplier onto the battlefield, milling Chris an additional 3 cards. Flayer's trigger will have him throw 1 point of damage at me, and then he'll sack his Stitcher Supplier yet again to his Phyrexian Altar, so he'll throw 3 more cards into his bin and float a mana. He has nothing left to do with it, so he passes over to Kyle, who draws, and then triggers Sylvan Library, drawing 2 more, as well as getting another cat token off of Joe Rael. He'll take 4 damage and return 1 card to the top of his library before casting Scoot Swarm. He plays a Swamp as his land for turn, triggering Scoot Swarm, getting him another Scoot Swarm. Also another elemental thanks to Zendikar's Royal. Then he casts Scape Shift.
Oh, that's pretty good.
It's like 7 lands.
Bro, what?
Get 7 lands.
So Kyle sacked 7 lands and gets 7 new lands out of his library, putting them right onto the battlefield, triggering absolutely everything. He gets 7 elementals, he gets 14 more Scoot Swarms, and then he gets 7 zombies because he brought out a Field of the Dead, which sees all of the new lands enter the battlefield as well. Well, Kyle became a pretty big threat. Before passing the turn to me, I play Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, and with that out, I move to combat, swinging my commander at Kyle in the air. This triggers Adeline, getting me 3 humans, each one of them attacking one of my opponents. I draw a card, discard a card, my opponents declare blocks, and then first strike damage will resolve from my commander, bringing back Sir Conrad the Grim from my graveyard. Normal combat damage will resolve, killing 2 of my human tokens because of the blocks that Kyle and Chris lined up. When those 2 die, it'll trigger Sir Conrad twice, dealing each of my opponents 2 points of damage. I pass the turn over to Scott, who plays Bonder's Enclave, a nice additional way for him to draw some cards. He plays his commander, Etali, Primal Conqueror. When this enters the battlefield, bad stuff happens for his opponents. We start exiling the top cards of our library until we hit a non-land card, and then Scott gets to cast them for free. He gets a Nyx Bloom Ancient, an Ashnod's Altar, a Wayward Swordtooth, as well as a Necromancy, which he has resolved first. Necromancy targets Chris's Dockside Extortionist in his graveyard. When that enters the battlefield, he'll generate 6 treasure tokens. But each one of those taps and sacks for 3 manas, so he'll use 2 of them to cast Nalfeshni. This thing will start copying spells he casts from exile. He casts Conjurer's Closet, which is probably going to be really good for him and really bad for us. And finally, he casts Shaman of Forgotten Ways. Before he moves into his end step, he blinks Etali with his Conjurer's Closet. He gets a Nissa, who shakes the world, an Animate Dead, Tatiana, Protector of Argoth, and a Silverwing Squadron as well. With those spells on the stack, he sacrifices his Dockside Extortionist to Ashnod's Altar, sending it back into Chris's graveyard, triggering my Sir Conrad and throwing some damage at my opponents. He then has the Animate Dead resolve, which is copied because of Nalfeshni, returning the Dockside Extortionist with the copy, as well as Chris's Blood Artist on the proper Animate Dead. Smart, because the copies will be sacked at his end step. So Dockside hits the battlefield, giving him 6 more treasure tokens. He has Titania resolve, again getting another copy of it as well. The second copy dies immediately. He'll bring back his Urza Saga from the graveyard to the battlefield. He only has 1 land to return though, so that's it. Then the Silverwing Squadron plus copy enters the battlefield, and finally the Nissa, who shakes the world. Again, the legendary stuff dying immediately. All of the dying creatures triggers Sir Conrad as well as the Blood Artist on Scott's board, and Scott will aim the Blood Artist triggers at me. After that impressive turn of events, he passes the turn over to Chris. He starts things off by sacking his Flayer to Phyrexian Altar, triggering Conrad and Blood Artist. With the help of that mana, he casts Black Sun's Twilight, where X equals 6, targeting Nalfeshni, because that thing is doing work. This also allows him to return a creature from the graveyard to his battlefield, and it's a Flayer of the Hatebound. He uses its ETB trigger to kill Shaman of Forgotten Ways. And of course, each time these creatures are dying, they're triggering Sir Conrad and Blood Artist. Scott begins targeting Kyle with Blood Artist triggers, dropping him to 2. Chris sacked his Flayer, and it returns with a +1 counter on it. With its ETB, Chris targets Blood Artist. In response, Scott sacks Titania, dropping Kyle to 1. And then when Blood Artist dies, he points that triggered ability to Kyle, knocking him out of the game. Sorry, Kyle. During cleanup, we forgot to pick up Wayward Swordtooth, but it does not matter at all for the game. Just pretend it's not there, because we did. Chris moves to combat with Sun Titan at Scott, getting back his Dockside Extortionist from the graveyard. Flayer will have him throw 1 point of damage at Etali after he created 11 treasures. Scott declares blocks with Etali, but activates his Voyager Staff before damage, therefore exiling Etali and returning it at the end of Chris's turn. In his second main phase, Chris casts his own Conjurer's Closet. What? There's so many closets. This turn, he activates Liliana, forcing his opponents to discard or take 3. And in response to that ability, Scott casts Denting Blows, aka Kroxa Grip, reskinned. This will have him destroy the Phyrexian Altar on Chris's side of the board. Then, Liliana's ability will resolve. I'll take 3 damage because I have no cards in hand. Neither does Scott, so he drops to 28. On Chris's end step, Voyager's Staff will have Etali return to the battlefield, and Chris was able to target something with Conjurer's Closet. Etali comes back first, so we exile cards off the top of our library, and Scott gets to cast a Nature's Lore, a Perpetual Timepiece, and Darn, because we keep it PG on this channel. With Darn, he targets Sir Conrad the Grim on my board. In response, I activate him, milling the top card of each of our libraries, and then dealing 1 point of damage to each of my opponents because Dauthi Voidwalker hit Chris's graveyard. Darn resolves, killing my Sir Conrad the Grim, making me very sad. Scott resolves the Perpetual Timepiece as well as Nature's Lore, so he'll go find a land from his library and get a forest out into the battlefield. Then Chris's Closet ability resolves, flickering Sun Titan, bringing back Blood Artist. On my turn, I cast Icon of Ancestry in my first main phase. I go ahead and activate it, hunting for a knight, but in response, my sadness hits the stack because I find 3 lands. They go onto the bottom of my library, and then I move into combat. I have no good attacks against Scott, so unfortunately I have to attack Chris, not because I want to. But on the attack, Adeline triggers, making me 2 humans, and then my commander will trigger, drawing me a card, and then I discard that card immediately, because I got no cards in hand. Chris will take his first strike damage from my commander, and this allows me to bring back Sir Conrad before normal damage is resolved. My human tokens are blocked by my opponents, so those things will pop, triggering Sir Conrad and Blood Artist. And because Chris blocked with Kroxa and Kunoros, he'll gain 6 life before I pass the turn back over to Scott. He plays a Sword of Hearth and Home. That's great for him to continue to bounce his commander. So he equips it to Etali, and now he's pro-green and pro-white. So he moves to combat with Etali at Chris and my very own Silverwing Squadron at me. This generates him 2 Knight tokens whenever it attacks. Such disrespect. Chris declares blocks in an effort to absorb as much damage as possible, killing his Dockside Extortionist and his Flare, triggering Sir Conrad and Blood Artist, and after combat damage was dealt, he gets to blink his commander and go find a land from his library, all thanks to Sword of Hearth and Home. He throws another basic out onto his battlefield, and then his commander, Etali, will re-enter the battlefield, so we'll all exile cards off the top of our library, and can you believe it? He gets a 3 visits, a Karmic Guide, and an Entomb. Getting a Karmic Guide and an Entomb off the top of our libraries has to be like one of the luckiest things he could have done. He puts Keeper of Secrets into his graveyard, thanks to my Entomb. He then resolves his 3 visits, going and getting a land from his library and putting it out onto the battlefield. And then he has Karmic Guide enter the battlefield, getting that Keeper of Secrets back out onto his board state as well. We almost missed the trigger of Sir Conrad whenever he entombed his Keeper of Secrets into his graveyard. We resolved that now. Then he uses Sanctum of Eternity to bounce Etali back to his hand. And guess what? He casts Etali from his hand. Oh man. Talk about Blinkysaurus. So we exile cards off the top of our libraries until we hit a non-land card. He finds an Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, an Altar of Dementia, and a Crippling Fear. He casts Ulamog first, which will exile the Blood Artist and my Sir Conrad, then Altar of Dementia, as well as Crippling Fear, each one of those seeing Keeper of Secrets and dealing me a bunch of damage. When he cast Crippling Fear, he named Dinosaurs, so he wipes my entire board of creatures with the exception of my commander. And before I clean those up, we resolve his end step trigger, which will have Conjurer's Closet, once again bounce Etali, and this will have him cast for free a Lightning Greaves, an Anger, and a Soul Ring. So with Greaves and Soul Ring, he'll deal 3 damage to me, knocking me out of the game. We also pick up that Wayward Swordtooth. He deals 4 damage to Chris before passing the turn.
Dope. Nomad Outpost.
You got this, Chris.
With the writing on the wall, Chris activates Lily, dealing 3 damage to Scott before scooping up that game. Scott's overwhelming board state was just a little bit too much to deal with. Congratulations. And here's Meatball. He's so chunky. And there you have it. That's the game. So despite a couple of gameplay errors, we really hope you enjoyed the game. We'd love to hear your comments about these March of the Machine commanders. They were a lot of fun for us to build as well as play. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, thank you for watching.